Welcome to the Lifeboat Hour with your host, Carolyn Baker.
Everybody knows that the dice are loaded. Everybody rolls with their fingers crossed. Everybody knows the war is over. Everybody knows the good guys lost.
Thank you all for joining us today on the new Lifeboat Hour, where the conversation is often about climate change. Everyone who follows this podcast is likely to be well aware of abrupt climate change. If you're not familiar with that term, abrupt climate change, I'd like to take a moment to clearly define it. According to the Union of Concerned Scientists, the term abrupt climate change describes changes in climate that occur over the span of years to decades, compared to the human-caused changes in climate that are occurring over the time span of decades to centuries. From ice cores, ocean sediments, tree rings, and other records of Earth's past climate, scientists have found that changes in climate have occurred quickly in the past over the course of a decade. Now, my guest today is someone who's been tracking abrupt climate change for about 10 years, particularly with regard to Arctic ice melt and the release of deadly quantities of methane. Many of you have watched her two presentations on YouTube entitled The Arctic Methane Monster. And of course, I'm talking about Jennifer Hynes, who is a friend, colleague, and neighbor here in Boulder, Colorado. Jennifer Hynes is an avid climate researcher, an environmental activist, a student of Buddhism and Eastern spirituality, and a senior IT professional. A daughter of a foreign service officer, she grew up in Southeast Asia, Laos specifically, and West Africa in Ghana, and was exposed to indigenous cultures from an early age. This early exposure to culture in the developing world led her to a deep interest in the urgency of global warming and climate change, and she studied it as a layperson now for about a decade. In July of 2014, she developed a succinct presentation outlining the methane threat we face in our next chapter of life on Earth. Her first video, The Arctic Methane Monster's Rapid Rise, has since gone viral on the internet and has served to educate people around the world about the threat of near-term human extinction. Jennifer's continuing personal journey is one of uniting scientific discovery with the transformation of consciousness and how to find balance amidst coming chaos. Jennifer Hynes, welcome to the new Lifeboat Hour.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. It's really good to talk to you today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Well, me too. And I'd like to start out first with you giving us the current status of abrupt climate change in what you call the Disaster Rodeo Roundup. What are the latest unfolding ecological disasters?
Well, 2016 has really been one for the books, and we started out the year with a heat wave in the Arctic. Actually, over New Year's, it got above freezing in the Arctic, and there was rain, if you can imagine that, right around the winter solstice, and that had never happened as far as we know. And it's really just gone from there. I always say, as goes the Arctic, so goes the world. The Arctic really controls our climate, and the Arctic continues to heat up like an oven, and it's anomalously warm up there. In fact, we have just had another huge heat wave in the Arctic, and it went northward over Siberia and caused a huge heat up in Siberia and a huge heat wave in the Arctic itself. So there's a lot of melting going on in the Arctic and Siberia. And in Greenland as well, there's record ice loss, and it started melting sooner than it ever had melted before. So everything up in the Arctic area is destabilizing and melting and deglaciating. And this is causing, huge repercussions on the jet stream and the weather, because our weather is driven by the jet stream. And as the jet stream continues to weaken and to destabilize, we find consequent climate, downstream effects. For example, deluges. Deluges are becoming a lot more common. And just here in the United States, we've seen some pretty big deluges just in 2016 alone. We saw a big deluge in Houston. The Houston floods of last month were pretty astronomical. And just as we were able to catch our breath from that, then there was a big deluge in Florida. And I think they got something like 22 inches of rain just in one day. So, these deluges are picking up. As well, fires are picking up, and we're still experiencing Fort McMurray up in Alberta, and this is a giant fire right up by the tar sands. So a lot has been going on all over the world. As well, Antarctica is starting to destabilize, and we're seeing the Totten Glacier in East Antarctica, which was thought to be completely stable, starting to destabilize and give way, and that is basically an ice plug for a huge amount of ice in East Antarctica. And if that starts to go away, which it appears it's starting to destabilize, then that's going to release and entrain all this glacial melt down to the sea, which will cause sea level rise as well. So a lot of things are on the horizon and happening right now. So it's pretty dramatic out there in the Climate Rodeo Roundup.
Well, thanks for that update. And now that you've presented this litany of ecological horrors, I'd like you to talk about us, or talk to us specifically about the implications of this and give us the big picture of the planetary impact of all of this.
Well, we call our planet Earth, but it's really ocean, because ocean takes up like 70% of the mass of what you see on the surface. And we have seen this year a huge bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef, and this is due to the extremely high ocean temperatures. So if the oceans all die, which it appears that that's what's happening, this is our link to life, and these are the lungs of the Earth. So when the ocean collapses, that's the end of life on Earth. And ocean collapse is well underway. We've seen there's massive fish die-offs, massive seabird die-offs, turtles, sea lions, starfish, whales, fish, coral bleaching, mangroves. And it's just kind of a litany of horrors. And it's basically ecocide, and it's rendering our Earth uninhabitable. And the planet cannot regenerate itself as quickly as industrial culture is destroying it. So we find ourselves in a very non-linear change. In fact, we think, well, it's changing this fast, it's probably going to change that fast in the future, but that's not really what's happening. We have set off so many positive feedback loops that we're officially on a runaway train to a greater hell than we've already created. And the web of life is starting to break down. And there's no predictability at this point. Gaia, our Earth, is non-linear and an organic being, and she's changing very, very quickly. So, this puts us in a point of we have to contend with the fact that we're in abrupt climate change. And it's going to be heartbreaking, but it's going to be an awakening that everybody on Earth eventually is going to start to understand.
And it seems like we've set off, how many, do you know now at this date, how many positive feedback loops there are? They must be getting close to 100, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, I can't keep track of them anymore. I mean, every time you turn around, you see, oh, there's another relationship. Oh, this thing affects this thing. We're learning and adjusting our knowledge and putting them into models as we learn. But in fact, it's only, we're like kindergartners, looking at the Earth, and as soon as something happens, we say, oh, okay, so this is happening now, But in fact, we've set off so many positive feedback loops that it's just happening very, very quickly. I don't know how many there are at this point. I really lost track of them, but we're pretty...
Yeah, it doesn't matter so much that we know how many, but I want to make sure everybody listening understands what they are. So can you give us just a 25-cent version of what a self-reinforcing feedback loop is?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Earth is just one system. It's one being, and it has so many different parts, and so everything affects everything else. So, when you have, let's talk about albedo. Albedo is how dark something is and how much reflectivity it has. So, for example, when you have snow and ice that melt and it exposes the dark ground underneath, you've got greater heating and you've got less albedo. So there won't be as much reflectivity, and there'll be more energy that's absorbed, and that'll cause greater heat. And greater heat will cause, sea level rise, because it'll start to, cause greater melting of the glaciers. And it's just a way for us humans to try and start understanding, how does this whole being of Gaia, this organic, non-linear being, fit together? So it's our attempt to break down the nature of Gaia and understand how she works.
Yeah, and there's this 40-year lag time, right? Can you explain that just a little bit for people that might not be familiar with it?
Absolutely. So it has been identified that carbon dioxide has between a 20 and 40-year lag time before the heat is actually, realized. So, for example, we're in 2016. So let's be conservative and say there's a 20-year lag time. To go back to 1995, if there's a 20-year lag time, we would be experiencing now the heating that from the carbon dioxide emissions that were put out in 1995. That's one example. So what that means is, even if you reduce carbon emissions now, you won't really see the effect until further down the road. But by then, there's so many other positive feedback loops that have come into it, it gets very complicated. But it's really important to understand that there is a huge lag time between when something is emitted and when something is actually realized.
Thanks for that. That's a really clear explanation. And, listening to everything you've said so far is heartbreaking enough. But when I contemplate the so-called political leadership that we're likely to have here in the United States in the next decade, I got to tell you, I just want to go back to bed and pull the covers over my head. But I also know that to do that is futile, not to mention infantile. We all need at this time to put on our big girl and big boy pants and face the reality of this lack of leadership. So please spell it out for us.
Well, it's kind of stunning because, the science is just coming in resounding, and I myself can hardly keep up with the events, of our melting down climate. And you would think that somebody besides Bernie Sanders, who has, talked about climate change, would say something about the world that's just falling apart around us. And, let me just read you something that Trump said about global warming, which we know that he's not a proponent of global warming. He said it was actually created by the Chinese in order to make US manufacturing non-competitive. I mean, this is insanity. I mean, he will say absolutely anything, and it's absolute insanity. Cruz, I thought, was extremely scary. And he has been almost kind of like an inquisitor in a witch hunt. I've watched several videos on YouTube where he basically badgers people about global warming, and it's really unfortunate. But he says there's been no significant global warming for the past 18 years. Well, he should check his data, because that's absolutely incorrect. And he has to, A, look at the bigger picture, and B, look at current data, both of which are wrong. There are all kinds of denial. There's outright denial, like you have from Trump and from Cruz. And then there's kind of less severe denial, but it's denial nonetheless. I mean, Chris Christie has said, well, the climate has been changing forever, and it will always change, and man will contribute to it, but it's not a crisis. Well, this still is a misunderstanding of the situation that we're in, and none of these characters are taking anything into consideration. But just in case we think it's all on the Republican side, let's take a look at Hillary And she's absolutely complicit with the petroleum industry and the coal industry, and she does not take a strong stand on climate change or admit that it's a crisis. So, that's very difficult too. No leader that we will elect in this upcoming election will take any meaningful stand unless it's Bernie Sanders, and it doesn't look like that's going to happen. No one will take a meaningful stand or a significant stand about our crisis of global warming that's currently unfolding around us.
Yeah, and just in the last 2 days, Trump has said that when he becomes president, he will get us out of the COP21 Paris Agreement. We'll just trash that as far as we're concerned. And he wants to gear up Keystone Pipeline again. I heard him speaking today, and he said something like, well, my environmental standard is just very simple. I want clean water and clean air. Simple. It's like, dude, you got to take a look at why you don't have those and how to make that happen, which has everything to do with all of the other facets of climate catastrophe. So, yeah, it makes one's skin crawl to hear this kind of madness. Madness is the only word I have for it.
It absolutely does, Carolyn, and I'm feeling like we're living in a mad world. And I mean, if I thought that there was no hope and no way out of this before, just looking at the leadership we're about to elect into power, there's absolutely no hope.
Right. Well, we don't want to get off into talking about hope because we could talk about that all day. I just want to let folks know that I'm talking today with Jennifer Hynes, climate researcher and activist. And although the information she's presenting to us is not easy to take in, I know that listeners of the new Lifeboat Hour are courageous and tough people. In fact, that's precisely why I'm committed to having quality guests on this podcast and bringing us as much truth as I possibly can, along with tools that we can actually use to help us navigate the dire predicament in which we find ourselves. So I'm sure that if you're familiar with the Lifeboat Hour that I was hosting a year ago, that actually I started hosting in 2014, if you're familiar with that, at this time, you can see a dramatic improvement in the regularity and quality of our programming. When I was hosting with Progressive Radio Network, the station was having major challenges, and for whatever reasons, which I care not to judge, about half the time I would announce the airing of the show and it wouldn't happen at the scheduled time. And then in some cases, the station was not even able to record me because of technological failures or glitches. But today, the new Lifeboat Hour podcast is posted on Facebook every Monday morning and can be accessed from my website at carolynbaker.net, from Facebook, as I said, and also on the Podbean website. Now, that's spelled Podbean, like string bean or pinto bean or black bean, www.podbean.com. You can count on regular programming and having our podcast posted regularly. You can count on it when Monday arrives, you have access to the new Lifeboat Hour. So at my website and at the Podbean website, you have an opportunity to support this podcast by becoming a patron, which simply means that you can express your appreciation for the show by pledging a monthly contribution to the new Lifeboat Hour. And this past week, Elaine and Jenny became patrons, and Kevin donated to us through PayPal. For a pledge of $25 or more, you'll receive not only a mention on the new Lifeboat Hour, but a signed copy of one of my books. So please become a patron of the new Lifeboat Hour, and please visit my website at carolynbaker.net to learn more about my work and upcoming projects. And so today I'm talking with Jennifer Hynes about abrupt climate change. And Jennifer, you've told us what's happening on the political landscape, but what's happening on the scientific landscape? What are scientists saying?
Carolyn, all scientists, I would say 99, they always say 97% of the scientists are agreeing on climate change. No, it's actually a much higher number. It's probably something like 99, and I bet that 1% is paid. So there are so many people talking about this, but more recently I've become familiar with the work of Tim Garrett, who's actually a physicist, and he did a lot of work with the physics of clouds. And, he came to the determination through calculating via physics that we are on the path to wiping ourselves out, and we've always been on the path to wiping ourselves out because civilization is made of matter. So over a period like since 1970, since civilization has doubled its consumption and the biomass has halved. So, we have to understand we're made of matter, and everything we do in civilization comes out of matter, and it has to come from somewhere. So, we have gotten to a point where growth is not sustainable. And, that's just simple physics. And I think it's always good to go back to physics when you're talking about the physical world. It makes a lot of sense. This world also, James Hansen, this year also, James Hansen put out a pivotal new paper. And I think he had about 18 different authors that he was working with. And he showed in no uncertain terms that we are in a crisis, that we're in abrupt climate change, and that sea level is going to rise. And, when they say sea level is going to rise, it's not an insignificant thing, because there is about 200 feet of sea level rise wrapped up in Antarctica, and about 20 feet of sea level rise wrapped up in Greenland. And those areas those ice sheets are deglaciating at a tremendous rate right now. So what this means, of course, is that all of our sea cities are going to flood, and it's almost unthinkable. And that's, going to be the end of civilization right there. But I think before the sea level rises, people are talking about that as the biggest threat, but I don't think that's the biggest threat. I think the ensuing temperature rise that we're about to experience from excessive amount of methane that's being disgorged right now from the peat bogs up in Siberia and from the Arctic itself is going to create such an extreme temperature rise that it's probably going to break the ecology. So, all the scientists are pointing to the fact that we're in abrupt climate change, and so many have really taken to the airwaves and, thrown caution to the wind. People like James Hansen, who always, put out peer-reviewed papers and things like that, just kind of circumvented the entire peer review process to get his new paper out in a very short amount of time, relatively speaking. And people all over the world are starting up their podcast channels and speaking out, because the situation is so dire that the time for being cautious and being quiet has long since passed. And it's a time for realization and action, and for people to get aware that we are in a time of abrupt climate change, and that life on Earth is about to change very, very quickly for us.
Yes, and as you said earlier, the science is just bouncing off the walls. It's everywhere. Almost 100% of scientists agree on this. And you have to be really, really in denial to put your head in the sand about this. You really do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, in the next few weeks, I hope to have a couple of folks on who will speak to us more in depth about why psychologically people cannot handle this. So I've got some guests lined up, I think, who are going to be able to really, really talk about this. But in any event, I'd like to continue with my questions for you. I'd like you to tell us about your climate activism, and in particular, your climate activism this past year when you traveled to New Zealand. And before you do that, please tell folks where they can find your 2 Arctic methane monster presentations, which, folks, if you haven't watched, you absolutely must see.
Oh, Absolutely, I'll be happy to do that. First of all, search on my name in your favorite search engine, Jennifer Hynes, that's Hynes. Also put in a keyword like Arctic or methane, and you'll be able to see it right away. There are two videos that I have put out. There's the Arctic methane monsters rapid rise, which I put out 2 years ago about, and there's the demise of the Arctic. Methane Monster 2, and that was put out just about almost a year ago. So easy to find. I also have a website which you can find if you do a search for my name. That's probably where everything starts. And also if you want to find me in particular, you can look for me on Facebook, Answer Most Communication, and I put out a lot of interesting posts about the continuing breakdown of our culture and the things that people go through. The psychological things are really fascinating to me right now because it's just creating a lot of, froth and ferment in the human culture.
And what is your website, Jennifer?
It's jenniferhines99.wordpress.com.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
So your activism, and you're traveling to New Zealand.
Yes, I had the opportunity to travel to New Zealand this last February, actually, and Kevin Hester and I teamed up, and we spent 10 days going around the North Island of New Zealand and making presentations throughout. We made 3 main presentations about the situation that we're in with abrupt climate change and the methane situation. We made 1 presentation in Napier, 1 presentation which was very well attended and so interesting in Wellington, the capital of New Zealand, and 1 presentation in Auckland, in which Guy McPherson and Paul Beckwith also came in as guest speakers and chimed in and added their own bits of information and insight. So we had a very successful tour. We also did 2 interviews, and 1 interview in particular with Robin Westenra was absolutely fascinating because we took a different bent with it. We really talked about the humanitarian aspects of climate change and how do we respond to it. And we also talked about spirituality and climate change. And other 2 people that were interviewed were also women, Dido, a Tibetan teacher, and also Pam Crisp, a humanitarian who works with children in New Zealand, also were interviewed in that same interview, and I thought it came out very well. So that was wonderful. I think it's great that people are starting to get out of just the science and actually look about how do we respond in a humanitarian way to this very dire crisis that we find ourselves in. So the New Zealand tour went fabulously well, and I'd like to put special thanks out to Kevin Hester, who was absolutely amazing and squired me around for a whole 12 days in New Zealand. So thank you so much, Kevin. Also special thanks to Lyndon Watson, who arranged for our stay in Napier at Hawke's Bay, and also arranged for the presentation there, and also to Greg Hart, the owner of the ranch at Hawke's Bay. And also great thanks to Robin Westenra for taking time to interview me and the other people in Wellington. It was really very interesting. Kevin has recently come up with a new blog, which I invite everybody to take a look at. Just look up Kevin Hester. And he's got 1 post that I thought was fascinating, and it's the total lack of urgency in dealing with the climate emergency, because we are in an emergency, and yet there's almost 0 urgency in taking a look at that. So that's kind of where we're at right now. We have to come to grips. Now, more and more people are coming to grips with this unfolding catastrophe, and these great humanitarians and bloggers, environmentalists, who up until now have remained pretty hopeful, but then they're coming to this realization that this thing is really falling apart, and they're just writing these passionate and thoughtful pieces, and there's so much good material and good postings and bloggings going on about this right now. One in particular who I've just gotten turned on to lately, and I just love her work, is Deb Ozarko. And Deb Ozarko is an environmentalist living up in the British Columbia area. And she's a passionate activist, and she's a visionary, and she understands that we're in a situation of planetary hospice. But she hungers for a compassionate world, and everything she does in life revolves around that, even if it's too late. And that's kind of what we have to come to. I mean, what do we do when we realize it's too late? Do we stop living with joy? Do we stop living with passion? Do we stop what we're doing and just curl up in a ball and end ourselves? No, we keep going and we keep processing. So, yeah, these are things that are happening right now.
I'm very glad you mentioned Deb. I actually had a Skype conversation with her this morning. I'm going to be on her podcast later this summer, and I definitely want her on the new Lifeboat Hour. And yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. What do we do? Do we just, like you start digging our graves and bide our time until the end? Or do we live with joy and passion and purpose? And that leads to my next question. Jennifer, you and I are very aligned on the necessity of spiritual healing and the opportunity that catastrophic climate change presents for that, regardless of the outcome of our planet and our own lives. So I'd like you to talk about this because, as our friend Andrew Harvey says, trying to navigate the global crisis, which includes but is even larger than abrupt climate change, without a spiritual practice is like walking into a forest fire wearing a paper tutu. Please comment.
I couldn't agree more. We need tools. We need mental and emotional infrastructure and growth in order to handle the biggest crisis on Earth. We're facing something that no generation of humans has ever faced, and that is the demise of our planet. And how do we work with that? And, we can have a choice to just become bitter and curl up in a ball and become destructive. But, that just kind of wastes our entire life. So I'd like to turn to the work of Joanna Macy, who I'm really a big, big fan of. And she talks about gratitude. She says, gratitude is the primary wellspring of all religions. And, there's absolutely no excuse for making our passionate love for the world dependent on what we believe the outcome will be, whether life continues or not. So it's in this uncertainty that we come alive. So my point of view is this, we've hurtled off the cliff. And when I say we, I mean all of humanity and life on this world. We've got past the point of no return. And, different people will have different varying views on that, but my view is we've got past the point of no return. We're in overshoot, and we're kind of falling right now. And until we die, until this whole thing ends, we're going to be falling. So how do we choose to respond in this moment of falling? We can either do something positive, or we can, go negative. And it's a process. And once you accept that near-term human extinction is underway, you begin a process that will not really ever end for the rest of your life.
Thank you so much for that. I couldn't agree more. And you were talking a little bit earlier about tools, and I just want to mention that Ivy Cohn and I are almost finished with a series, a 3-part series on first aid for cataclysm. And we go in depth into some of the tools, emotional and spiritual tools that we can use to help us navigate this predicament. And we're going to be recording the 3rd one in that series very soon. But people can find the first 2 parts at my website under podcasts. That's me and Ivy Cohn talking about first aid for cataclysm. Visit the podcast section at my website, carolynbaker.net. So, Jennifer, I'd also like you to talk about the practice of compassion and a recent retreat that you attended.
Oh, thank you. Yes, be happy to. As many people know, I study with a Rinpoche from Bhutan, Lama Karma. And every year we have a Chenrezig Retreat. And Chenrezig is the Buddhist god of compassion. And Chenrezig is a pretty big deal in Bhutan. So for 7 days, I participated in a retreat. In the weekdays, it was just in the after hours after work, but during the weekend, it was, full days starting at 9:30 till 6, chanting, praying, doing mala and mantra, and really focusing on compassion and Buddhist values of joy and balance and equanimity and compassion. And these are the sorts of things that we focused on. And it's my opinion that the reason that we're in this mess at all is just the frame of mind that human beings and actually corporate culture and the elite have at large. And it's a view of separation. It's a view of fear, and there's not enough, and let's protect what's mine, and, I'm more important than you. And in the Buddhist practice of compassion, you really practice compassion for all beings, and you put out the energy that will heal all beings. And this is quite a bit different than the corporate view. And it's the alignment with these values that drives decisions. So if we come from a compassionate point of view, where we first think about, the well-being of others, and, that others matter just as much as we do, animals matter just as much as we do, it's the alignment with these values that drives downstream decisions. And I'd like to point out Bhutan as an example. And Bhutan's just a tiny, tiny little Himalayan country, but they have something called gross national happiness that they focus on. And it's basically adhering to these Buddhist values internally, and that's what drives their corporate decisions. So they run all of their national and corporate and country decisions through the filter of gross national happiness. And it gives them, I've been to Bhutan, and it's just an amazing place, and it's a very loving place. And, we could all profit from their examples. So, a lot of our problems stem in not having enough compassion and love in our hearts. And so, we could all stand to have more of that.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And, a moment ago, I quoted Andrew Harvey, and I'd like you to say more about what you've learned in working with Andrew, and what you've learned overall in your activism and in your commitment to integrate that activism with your spiritual path.
Oh, absolutely. Andrew is just such an amazing leader and thinker. Processor. I have nothing but amazing things to say about him. And I was very fortunate to actually have the opportunity to interview with him, I guess about 1.5 years ago. And it was really a wonderful experience. But, Andrew's, got some very good points. And I'd just like to go through a couple of points that he had brought up on your podcast a couple of weeks ago.
Sure.
And one is that America itself was founded on genocide. It became an empire, and it caused untold suffering and untold madness. And America has a psychotic personality. And America at large is addicted to power. And we also have the opinion that there's infinite growth, because we're always talking about growth, but there's no such thing as infinite growth. And there's really no such thing as democracy. And this dream is dying, and it's being expressed through hatred and racism and separation. And the future of our planet is actually at stake. So we need to make a radical move to have any chance of survival. So the thing about Andrew, and I just love the way he puts things, he says, everyone knows at some level that we're going through an evolutionary crisis. The interconnected psyches know that the environment is dying, and we know that there soon, for example, will be no fish in the sea. So this has been brought about by the madness of greed that drives us to suicidal and matricidal destruction of the environment. So Andrew is a huge proponent of shadow work because all of this brings up the deepest fears that we could possibly experience as beings. And so the greater part of Andrew's work these days has to do with the shadow work, and yours too, Carolyn. I think you're working with shadow as well.
Yeah, let me just interject here, if I may. My 2016 book, Dark Gold, The Human Shadow and the Global Crisis, is a toolkit for doing shadow work in a non-threatening way, doing it on your own, in your own time, with lots of support. And I really want to direct people to that book, which you can get on Amazon or at your local bookstore or through my website, Dark Gold, The Human Shadow and the Global Crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So ultimately, we have to get through to acceptance, and we have to get through the anger and the horror and this shadow death wish that humanity seems to have. And we have to release ourselves from the fantasy and illusion so we can claim ourselves at a deeper level. And we have to peel everything away till we're nobody and nothing. And we become our authentic selves at last. So, dealing with NTHE is really a spiritual growth process. And you can get to a place when you get to the deep, deep acceptance of it, where you touch the great bliss of spirit and from the place from which all things are born, and get to a place of creative ecstasy and blissful consciousness. And this requires a really massive commitment to align ourselves with joy and stay aligned to the ultimate truth. And it's a day-to-day process, and each day brings its own adventures. But ultimately, we have to make the radical commitment and recommitment to serve and to turn up.
Yes, and I'm so glad you're putting it in these terms, because facing near-term human extinction, really facing it and not running away, puts you immediately into existential territories, territories of meaning and purpose. What am I doing here? What's the meaning of my life? And in the face of this inevitable extinction that's going to happen sooner or later, and nobody has a correct date. We don't know exactly when it's going to happen. We only have speculation about that. Since that is happening so quickly and it's really in our faces, how are we going to live? Because how are we going to live will say a lot about how we're going to die. And we are going to die. And so that's why Guy McPherson and I wrote Extinction Dialogues, How to Live with Death in Mind, which is also, ironically, a very good book on how to live with life in mind. Mm-hmm. So one more thing, Jennifer, how can people contact you?
Probably the easiest way, look me up on Facebook. If you're friends with Carolyn, I'm in her friend list. My last name is Hynes, Hynes, Jennifer Hynes. You'll be able to find me pretty quick that way.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, so much for being my guest today on the new Lifeboat Hour. And folks, if you love this podcast, join us again next week, and do go to my website, click on podcasts, and become a patron of the new Lifeboat Hour. Until next time, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. You can hear all podcasts and learn about Carolyn Baker's other works at www.carolynbaker.net. Her daily news digest is available by subscription and is delivered to your inbox 7 days per week with real news on economics, environment, geopolitics, civil liberties, and cultural issues, plus links to articles on inspiration and resilience. Come sail with us again next week on the Lifeboat Hour.